welcome. It's summertime, so we're doing these a little bit more sporadically than every week, just because I'm in and out a lot of places. Summer with things the kids are doing. Let me get muted here for everybody. Just because it can be embarrassing to accidentally say something and have everybody hear it when you're not expecting to. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about, first of all, give me a thumbs up. Can you hear me? I've been known to mess up the audio before. So can everybody hear okay? All right. Okay, so we're going to be talking about coaching Agile delivery. And what I'm wanting to kind of talk through a little bit is when I'm working with a team, particularly the teams that have been successful, what does that look like? Like, what does it look to try to take a team that's you got a bunch of maybe well-meaning people, but get them working together to be able to deliver in an Agile manner. So we're going to look at some of the things, some of the ways that I think are helpful to think about delivery, and some of the things, sometimes small things that have big impacts with teams to get teams thinking about that and everybody headed in the right direction. Next talk coming up will probably be August 1st. We're going to be looking at Agile principle number 6. I've got some others planned coming up. I'm going to do a test-driven development and pair programming demo here coming up, but I've got to work that out. If everything comes together, my son and I are going to be doing it, so it'll be pretty interesting to do and fun for me. Okay, so talking about Agile delivery, and I want you to think for a minute, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to this, but how many principles actually mention Agile delivery? So in Slido, how many Agile principles mention delivery? Is it 2, 4, 6, 8, or whatever you think is the closest? And I will put, you should have Slido there, but I'll put a link into it if you want to use that instead of the what shows up inside of the in WebEx. Okay, so and like I said, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to this because there's several that mention it explicitly, but I think a lot of them really mention it like it's implied in what it's talking about. So we're going to look at some of the Agile principles and think about what does that actually tell us about delivery. So, and if you're not used to doing this, either go to that link or open the Slido because we use a lot of polling and we'll have a game at the end where you can win a t-shirt. So make sure you've got that up as we go through things. Okay, so it looks like most of us are thinking about 4, and I think that sounds about right. But I would make a case that many of the Agile principles actually do imply something about delivery. So let's take a look at some of those. So obviously, principle number 1, our highest priority is satisfy the customer with the early and continuous delivery of valuable software. So this mentions it explicitly. We're going to that the most important thing we should be focused on is being able to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. And one thing I want to mention about this particular principle is I like how it kind of constrains. That word continuous is very, very important. If we take out the word continuous, it could lead us to do a lot of things that get an early version of the software out, but that we can't ever deploy again, or there's so much, it's untestable, so we can't make any changes without breaking everything. But the early and continuous together should be able to guide us in making sure that we're doing things that aren't just we're going to deliver early, but are also sustainable. And we'll look at what some of those things look like. But if you're working with a team, either in the area of as a coach or just even within your team, making sure that you're looking at both of those things and how you deliver software, you're going to deliver early and you're going to deliver continuously. Those things have to work together. And some people see those things as being at odds. I would say they're not, and we'll look at that more as we go. So question for you, how satisfied has your customer been with your last 5 deliveries? So if our goal is to satisfy the customer, how satisfied has your customer been? Have they been like, hearts in the eyes? Have they been crying? Have they been about in between? Looks like most of us are kind of they've been happy with it. So that's great. Maybe there's some room for improvement, or maybe this is just where we play. Maybe it's a customers are hard to impress, so this might be just awesome here. But it looks like most of us are trending toward the right-hand side of it or in the middle. A couple of us have probably had some instances where the customer, whatever was delivered didn't necessarily satisfy the customer or make them happy. I mean, we'll talk about some ways to maybe increase the satisfaction level with customers. Okay, Agile principle number 3, deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference to the shorter time scale. So once again, we've got the word deliver. I like it's got to be working software, right? We're going to be doing it frequently. But once again, this has the idea that it's not just a one-time event, right? It's not just, oh, we're going to get something really fast out the door. We need the big picture of how are we going to be able to continuously deliver stuff to the customer. So how frequently does your team deliver working features to your customer? Is it on a scale, 1 is every day and 5 is every year? Where do you fall kind of in between that? This isn't particularly granular, but just let's think about how often we deliver working features to our customer. So it looks like most of us, no one's taking a full year to do, a couple of us are delivering every year. Okay. No one's doing every day, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I know the segment of people probably coming to this are, a lot of you are working in areas that are highly regulated, finance and things like that. So deploying every single day there may be reasons that that's not what you're striving for, but we should be pushing toward being more frequent. Looks like most of us are somewhere between every day and every year. Not sure what that represents necessarily for us, but we're deploying regularly, but maybe not as frequently as we could be. So some things we're going to talk about, we may be, wherever you are now, I want you, as we're talking through these things, I would encourage you to think about, are there some things you could do that could push your answer a little bit more to the left here in ways that would actually better satisfy the customer, lower risk, and increase your return on investment? Okay, Agile principle number 7. Working software is the primary measure of progress. So this is one that doesn't explicitly mention delivery, but it does kind of imply that we're going to be delivering something to the customer that works in some way that they're able to, it's able to do some type of work. Most software has to be, that process of getting it to where it can do work is usually what we call delivery. So this implies that we're going to have to deliver software in order to say that we're making progress. And a lot of the Agile principles, I didn't list every single one, but a lot of them kind of do have some tie back to we're getting something through to where it can do work for the customer. And then here's one: simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. And the reason I put this one here is because this isn't usually one we think about when we think about delivery. But I think it does have some important things to say about how we deliver. Especially the idea that trying to deliver something in a simpler form is probably okay. Trying to maximize the amount of work not done. If there's something small that we can deliver through to the customer that gets us some feedback that can help guide our efforts for the next stage of it, it probably is going to be better to deliver that all the way through to the customer, take the feedback and work on the next piece of things. If we say, oh no, well, we know they need all these other things, so there's no sense even delivering any of it until we can deliver all of it, we may be setting ourselves up for some of the failures that Agile is specifically designed to try to prevent. Okay, so here's, so in thinking about delivery, and this is kind of, I want us to think about this idea of kind of not actually the tension, but the direction that we get from knowing that we need to deliver frequently and also that we need to deliver continuously. So imagine you got a continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline. It does your build, it runs your tests, all those things that gets the software either through to the deployment, to the production environment, or to the staging environment if you're working on software that's not going all the way through to production yet, to where users can use it. It validates that everything worked. It integrates everything all together. Whatever that pipeline looks like for your project, of getting it all the way through to where it's in production or a production-like environment. And you've got choice between two different things. And these are realistic types of choices and trade-offs I've seen teams have to make. So in one case, you can get feedback in 5 minutes. It takes 5 minutes to do the complete build, run all the tests, and get it deployed into the environment where the customer can actually get their hands on it. But 10% of each developer's time has to be spent maintaining the CI/CD pipeline. So it's really, really fast feedback, but the developers are having to maintain the pipeline themselves and everything, and it takes them about 10% of their time. So let's say 4 hours a week per developer to do that. But anytime a developer makes a change, in 5 minutes they can get feedback and get that change all the way through deployed to environment that a production-like environment that the customers can use. On the other hand, you've got another option. Let's say somebody's providing the CI/CD pipeline to you, and so you don't have to maintain this at all. Your developers don't have to. I wouldn't say they don't have to think about it, but they can't even make any changes to it, right? So they're not going to spend time actually making changes to it. But it takes 60 minutes for everything to go through that process. And the reason this is, I've seen teams have to make these trade-offs before, is because in this in this top example, the 5-minute feedback, if the developers are actually spending their time maintaining it, yeah, like Ian said, that they feel the pain and they they'll go ahead and fix things. But also it could be a situation where, since they have to maintain the pipeline for themselves, it can be laser focused on this particular application. It doesn't have to be generic in a way that's being provided for the entire organization in a way that will do everything that could possibly want to be done. It can be just, here's exactly what we need for this particular application, and it's laser focused on what this application needs to run very, very quickly and get us the feedback quickly. Now, so with these two things, so which do you think is better? And there is not, I will give you a hint, there is not a right answer here. Both of these could be better in a particular thing, but just from the way you've experienced things and the way you work today, which of these would you rather choose? And a lot of this is going to come now. We'll graph these things out and kind of see where the breakover point is. So it looks like most of us are kind of leaning toward the 5-minute feedback as being worth more than not having 4 hours a week. Or it could be that a lot of people up here have actually experienced things where you were giving a pipeline that you were told you can just use this, and discovered that you really have to spend a lot of time on it anyway to understand it and get it to do what you want. But there are some of us in the camp of saying, hey, if I didn't have to think about my pipeline at all, 60-minute feedback is great. And if I don't have to think about my pipeline at all, that would be valuable. Coffee time is not wasted. Maybe. But either of these answers, in different situations, these would be right. But let's think about this, because we have to make these types of trade-offs. Your teams are making these types of trade-offs. And if we're not careful, we can choose something that sounds really good, or would be good under certain circumstances that we're not actually going to be in. So we've got the number of hours we have to spend waiting on stuff up and down over there, and then the builds per week. So on the thing where we have to spend 4 hours, we start out, even if we do no builds per week, right? We're spending 4 hours a week maintaining this thing. So that's just a sunk cost, 4 hours. And then for every build we do, it increments by 5 minutes. So that graph is going to look something like this. We can do many builds with very small increase in the number of hours over that 4-hour mark. But we've got that 4-hour mark that we've got anyway. So there's the first one graphed. The other one would look something like this. Now, it starts out, if we're doing just one build a week, it's, we're only spending an hour waiting for that build to run. So it's much slower, right? We're 1 hour versus the 4 hours. But it doesn't take very long before we're past that, we're at the crossover point. And this one gets a lot more expensive in terms of time if we're doing lots and lots of build. In fact, if you make enough small changes, you'll spend all your time waiting. And what happens is, if you've worked in an environment that's like that green line there, what you end up doing is you don't want to make small changes all the way through, because it takes a long time. And I know for many of us, even an hour getting all the way through to deployed, tested, integrated, deployed to a production-like environment may not sound like very much time. But if you're trying to make very, very small changes and all the way through, compared to 5 minutes. So the actual numbers here are what important. What I want us to be thinking about, though, is, are we making a trade-off in terms of, hey, I don't have to think about this, but I'm doing it in a way that actually hurts me in terms of my feedback frequency. So those two things, what we want to be careful is, and if we get to the point where we're trying to make lots of changes, really, really small changes really, really fast, that pipeline is eventually going to slow us down. The green one's going to become a huge bottleneck that we're having to wait for. And we can end up in a situation where we think we're using Agile principles to drive us like an antelope. We're going to be an Agile antelope. We're going to be Agile and do all these things. But we're really just turning into waterfall walruses. And the reason I got these pictures out here is because for me, when I saw this or put this together, it was kind of like, okay, there's lots of times where I'm like, oh, I think I'm an antelope, but I'm not. I'm actually a walrus here doing things really, really slow, because I'm doing things that I think are making me fast, but they're not. They're really just slowing me down. And nothing against walruses. Walruses are great, but they are significantly slower, especially on land compared to antelope. Okay, so that is kind of the background. Let's start talking through some things in coaching delivery. And what I want to do is just hit some points that when I'm working with teams, we usually try to talk through. Some of the key things that I found useful to get teams thinking in terms of how do they deliver, and less in terms of less about how do we stay busy and more how do we go ahead and optimize all the work we're doing to deliver stuff through to the customer in a way that will make us successful and lower our risk. So one simple thing, and I'm sure you've heard me, if you've been to my other talks, you've heard me mention this before, but starting on the right. So this is a very simple thing you can do in your stand-up, but it makes a huge difference. So let's say here's our board of things that we're working on. A lot of teams will come in and at their daily stand-up, they'll go around and have everybody tell what they're working on. That isn't necessarily bad, but we should ask ourselves, does that really align our work with the idea of agile delivery, where our goal is to satisfy the customer, early delivery, continuous delivery of software to them. Other teams come in and they kind of start over here on the left and go through, okay, what do we have ready to start on? Who's going to start it? And then we look at what's in requirements, kind of move across like that. What I would like to suggest is that we start, our goal is to get here to done. Not everything on this board is in the same state or the same readiness to move to done. As a matter of fact, there's two stories here in testing that are closest to being done. If we can put our effort into getting something from testing to done, that gets us a return on investments much sooner than trying to get things from ready into requirements. In this particular case, we've got the one in testing that's red, which means we're running into problems we need help with it. So this is the type of thing that if you can get your teams thinking in terms of how do I finish stuff. So what would happen here in a daily stand-up comes, okay, these two things testing. How can the team organize their work today to get testing across the line to done? It may be somebody that was working on something over in requirements happens to know the stuff that needs to be done to get that testing thing unblocked and move over. It may be that somebody that was working on development work actually would make sense to pull them and get them working on this thing and testing to get it done because we're running into something or they have the knowledge or the person that was going to work it is on vacation or whatever it is. Once we have a plan for the optimal way to get those things from testing to done, then let's go to development. Say, these are the stories we're working on developing. What's the best thing we can do to keep moving these forwards today? And then once we've got a plan for that, we may get to requirements, say, okay, nobody's available to work on requirements. Well, that's fine because we're working on the most important thing, which is to get these things delivered to the customer. So, and I'm making simple examples here, but the more you can get your team thinking like this about how do we actually finish stuff, the better your flow will be, the better your return investment is, and the faster you'll be able to get stuff into the customer's hands and start getting feedback on it. So asking the team, what can we finish, right? We've got these things back to that board. We've got this. What's the things that is there anything we could possibly finish today? And how can we organize our work to finish something? We want to change the mindset of the team. We shouldn't be happy about, hey, look how much work we're doing. We should be looking at how much work has been completed and what can we finish? What's the things that we can actually finish and complete today? So here's a picture of a house, right? You probably wouldn't want to live in this house, right? If you're looking to buy a house and you saw this house for sale, this probably wouldn't be the house that I'm going to buy that and move in tomorrow, right? You know, you may buy it and once it's finished, but right now it's not in a state that you're going to give the builders money for it. In other words, the builders cannot get a return on investment when the house is in this state. But let's say the builders do this. And they've got 8 houses out there or 20 houses. They've got all these houses that are still in this state. And when it comes to building, there might be reasons to do that. But let's say something happens in the market and the builder runs out of money. Something happened. They're fraud. They run out of money. Now they've got 8 houses that are started. They're in a lot worse situation than if they can get one house across the line and get it built. Then they can actually start returning investment on it. Or what happens if once you get the 8 houses to this state, you've got the stairs built and everything like that. I don't know if there's stairs in those houses yet. You got the sewer pipes in the concrete base and everything. Then you come in, you find out the stairs are too narrow to meet code, and we need to use a different sewer pipe through the concrete foundation. Well, that's going to be a lot more expensive to fix at this particular point where you've got 8 of them in flight than if you can get one across the line, get that feedback, and then know what to do for the next. Now, making analogies with building, concrete is not code. Making analogies with building, there may be some reasons you need to do construction, something like this, and maybe they work on a different level of granularity. But the point still stands, though, that the more things you have in flight, the more risk you have that if something goes wrong, it's going to be a lot more expensive to fix it in a lot of different places. And if money becomes tight, the market changes or something like that, this represents significantly more risk than getting one thing done across the line and selling it. So getting your team to start thinking about how can we start earning a return on the investment we've made so far is a very important way to make sure that you're pushing toward agile delivery, that you're thinking in terms of how do we start on the right and finish stuff rather than think about how can we start new stuff. So starting on the right, here's some questions to ask yourself and ask your team. So are we focused on finishing what we have started? If we get halfway through a sprint and everybody stops working, I don't know, everyone gets sick and gets sent home, there's a pandemic, something like that. But if we get halfway through a sprint and everyone stops working, will we have completed the most important things? I once did a little diagram for a team I was working with, and I was like, if we had this magic box that we could go take things that we had worked on, run it through it, and get the things that we now see are most important, that'd be great. We don't have that box. We just need to make sure that we're really laser focused on prioritizing to make sure that if we stop working, we are very, very happy with what has been done. And it was the right choice. Another question to ask is, what is the inventory value of the work that hasn't been delivered? Do we have all these things that are building up as inventory that if we worked it in a slightly different way, we might be able to deliver that and start getting a return on investment from it? What is the risk that we're just on the edge of learning something very important? We could be at a place where we're building something, we haven't deployed anything all the way through to production, and when we get ready to deploy it through to production, we discover there's some security requirement that requires us to completely rethink our architecture. Or we discover that the environment we're going to requires a newer version of something than what we've been using, and that newer version has some significant API changes for us. So there's lots of things like that we need to be thinking of. How do we go and lower our risk by getting things all the way through, completed, into the hands of the customer, into the production environment? So in thinking about your team or yourself personally, which is easier for you, to start on a new story or to finish the story all the way through to production? And I know for me, it's often a lot easier and a lot fun to start a new project, start a new story, than it is to get one project all the way through to production. I have a few incomplete robots laying around here that are testaments to that, where I got one, got it working, kind of got some things. I had some ideas of what I want to do, and then I started on a different project. So it's human nature. But what we want to do is make sure that we're not letting human nature drive us to starting more work when we really should be focused on finishing all the way through to production. Now, this says that 21% of us say it's easier to finish a story all the way through to production. So that's great. You guys are in a very, very good position if that's how your team is responding, or how your team is working. So that's awesome. If a member of your team delivers a story, what are they most likely to do next? See if they can help any of their teammates deliver whatever story they're working on, start a new story, or play solitaire for the rest of the day. And I would encourage teams to work, if you're working in pairs on stuff, usually that's more efficient. But if a pair finishes on something, do they go start a new story, or do they go try to find someone else that they can get their story across the line? Now, there may be situations where it absolutely makes sense to start a new story. But I would suggest that with most teams, if they're not going and checking with their teammates first to see if anything else, the people on the team for whatever the product is, if they're not checking with the team to see the other team say, is there anything we can do to help you finish stuff? This gives you some room for improvement. Now, even if 90% of the time the answer is no, we don't need any help for anything, if even occasionally somebody says, yes, we're testing in this and we're running into problems, can you come get your eyes on it and tell us if you see something? Because if we can get the story through, then it would make this sprint. If that happens even a small percentage of the time, it has a significant impact on your project's ability to deliver for the customer. Okay, Next point, wanted for in thinking of coaching your teams, and keep in mind when I'm saying coaching, many of you are probably in some type of coaching role. You may be a scrum master, you may be a formal coach, but when teams are working together and really encouraging each other and taking full advantage of everyone's contribution, coaching should be happening in all different directions, right? We should be encouraging each other toward being better and taking encouragement and suggestions from people and being better ourselves. So we're talking about coaching. It's not just matter if you're in a formal coaching role. This is about how you work together as a team. So other important thing that I usually try to really help teams think about when I'm working with them is emphasize the definition of done. So question, does your team have a definition of done? Do you have a definition? So yes, it's very explicit. Maybe you've got something written down, or no, we don't have any definition of done, or yeah, we've got something of a definition that's mostly informal. Maybe it's not written down, or maybe we just talked about it, or it's kind of a little bit loose. But just want to see where people are at. And I tend, on one hand, I tend to be. I've seen some definitions of done that get so detailed that you start wondering if it's worth the effort that's going into it. On the other hand, I've seen some teams that have without any definition of done, to where when somebody says they're done with something for a sprint, you have no idea what actually is included in it and what they've done and what you can expect once you try to use it. So based on that, I generally tend toward having a more explicit version. For most teams is usually worth the effort of putting into it. It doesn't. The big thing you want to make sure though is that you're not getting in a situation where one person thinks, and I've worked with teams that have this like, oh yeah, this software is done, and then somebody else pulls in their changes and discovers it hasn't been tested, it doesn't deploy with all the code that's in the environments and stuff. It's just, and when they said they were done, they just meant I've written a bunch of code and hopefully it works. Anything you can do to steer around that to where everybody agrees and everybody's got the respect for each other, that I'm making a change and I'm going to validate that it works. I'm going to write my automated test. I'm going to actually check it. Maybe I'm even going to show it to the customer in a local environment to make sure it's really what they want. Whatever those things are. I usually really try to get teams to think of that software isn't done until it's in production and the customer is using it, because there's always a chance, and often a very high chance, that there's some hidden work between whatever point you're saying, oh, okay, we're going to start working on something else, and whatever it takes to get that into the hands of the customer. Now, on greenfield projects, that can lead to very uncomfortable, because we've got all this work that's piling up because it hasn't, we don't have our deploy or production environment yet or something like that. But that uncomfortableness is probably a really good thing, to see the stuff piling up, because that helps you see the risk. It helps you see the risk of, here's all the stuff that we really haven't proved can go to production yet. So I encourage teams to really try to make sure that you can, it's very, very clear whether something's through and in the hands of the customer and in production and doing work, or it's in some state before that. Because if you lose track of that, you can, I don't know if you've ever seen things like we had a 2-year project. We get to the end of the 2 years, and now we've got another 2 years of trying to figure out how to get it deployed. Yes, it worked in my local environment. I've never heard anyone or said that. Okay, what is the most important item on your definition of done? So most of us have a definition. So whether it's explicit or, and if you don't have one, feel free to say what you think the most important item would be. So no right or wrong answer here. I'm just curious, what do you think the item is on your definition of done that you say, this is the most important thing to our team? Deployed in production. Awesome. So that sounds great. Done in dev. Okay. Testing is done. Does it meet the customer? Has the customer actually said this is what they wanted? In production, approved by PO. Solution is fully tested and the branches merged. So we proved it works with everybody else's. Is it merged into all versions? Testing complete. Deployable in prod. CI/CD pipeline completed. Okay, and these are all good. Works on my machine. I'm not sure that's the best definition, but maybe that's where you're at. Nothing else to do, so it means it's in prod. Deployed as high as we can get it. And for a lot of places, that's what you got. Like, what's our highest environment? I have worked on teams that when they were creating their environments, it was for a greenfield project. they had testing stuff they did in cloud, and then they were going to have a UAT environment in an on-prem. They were going to have a simulation environment on-prem and the production environment on-prem. Those on-prem things were going to take a while to set up. So they put the production environment in first. And the reason is because they wanted to prove they could deploy to production, because there were all kinds of things they had to meet in the production that they didn't need to meet necessarily in UAT. And so they built that first. So they even stood up their environments in a way to be able to make sure they could say they were going to production sooner. Now, it had to be deployed on the other stuff eventually, but as they were doing development work, even though it wasn't the system of records, the customer was going into production and seeing it in the actual production environment. Ready for install, deployed as high as we can get it, testing and code changes complete. So yeah, these are all, well, most of these are all great things to have on your definition of done. The things that I find are really important is, yes, we've actually, not only have we written the code, but we have tests.
That we were asking the instructions for is going to be relevant because we can't mix the groups anymore. That's what I meant to ask. Because remember,
I don't think that's for us, so I'm going to mute you. If that was something you want to say, mention it in the chat, and you can come back on. So the where was I talking about? Oh, okay. So being able to say, not only have we written this code, but we've made our requirements executable. So if someday this changes and our code no longer does what we decided it needs to do, we will find that out. So that can be another very important part of definition done, which could come under testing, but maybe a little bit more, even more robust than that. We have this set up to where not only have we shown this code works, but we have a mechanism in place to prove it always works. So if something ever changes, we'll know about it. Okay, so under the emphasizing the definition of done, making sure you've decided what does it actually mean to be done with something. Make sure the team agrees and everybody's working off the same definition. Asking yourself how much work is left to do once we say we are done, right? If you're working in an environment where people are saying that you're done, but it's not actually tested, hasn't been shown to the customer, hasn't been deployed, you probably need to change your definition of done, or come up with something else that represents some other word that's going to be used to represent that, and make sure people are very, very clear that when you say done, it's not actually done. And is our definition of done growing as our capabilities grow? There may be situations where we say that something's done because it does all these things that we knew about at the time, but as we discover other things, maybe there's some new security requirement we have to meet that wasn't there when we started the project. That should probably go into our definition of done in order to make sure we're continuing to grow that definition as new things happen. It's not something you want to write in stone. It's something you want to make sure you're adapting as you go forward. Now, one thing I've seen people do is they discover, oh, it's hard to deploy to production. That takes a long time and things break. So what we're going to do is change our definition of done in order so we can say we're done with this stuff, because we don't want to look bad to the customer. That's not what the purpose of the idea of a definition of done isn't so you can take things out of it to make yourselves look good, right? The idea of the definition of done is to make sure that you don't have any hidden work. And if you find your team taking things out of it in order to look better, to push work off so it's hidden somewhere, oh, my arms disappear when they go there, don't they? Okay. To push work off to where it goes somewhere else, that's what you want to avoid. You don't want to get in situations where you're making yourself feel good at the expense of taking on risk. Done and done, which actually the second done is the real done. Yes, I've worked with things like that. As a matter of fact, I think it was a conversation I had with someone. They said, really, we've got two definitions of done. And I said, shouldn't our definition of done mean it's in production and the users are using it, right? It's actually done, it's delivering value for the users. And she thought for a moment and said, oh, okay, so I guess now we've got three definitions of done. I was like, no, that's not what I was trying to suggest is another definition. I'm trying to constrain the definitions we already have. And some of this comes down to semantics. I have found it useful to be very, very protective about what we allow to say that's done. If we want to say that something's ready for deployment to production, but it's not deployed, let's call it ready for production deploy. If we want to say something has made it through testing. Let's say it's made it through testing. But let's protect the definition of done, because if we're not careful, we can mislead our stakeholders and they'll think that we're at one point without actually understanding the risks that are involved in it. And if we keep saying that things are done and then get to the point and say, okay, now we're going to deploy and it's going to take 2 or 3 weeks, people will feel like they've been misled because we've been saying things are done. So it's just, I'd encourage you to try to protect the word done. And if you have to say there's done and done, it's, your culture may support different things, but I think there is value in calling things done when they're actually done, and actually getting value for things. Okay, so just a diagram. So here's you. There's production. There's your code. So at this point, the delivery, it's delivered, right? It's in production, and they could start getting value from it. Done starts sounding like a song. Yes. So this is, and it's silly, but think about this, right? If the person, you got this box of something that's valuable to your customer, you got this box that you're carrying it around, and you're like, okay, I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it on the cart. And like, I'm done. No, it's not done until you've actually delivered it to production, delivered it to your customer. So question for you, when did your team last deliver to production? Was it last week, last month, last quarter, 6 months ago, or last year? And it's not like one of these is for your team. I mean, I've worked with teams that the fact that they've delivered every 6 months is a huge improvement because they were on a timetable that was taking them 2 years to deploy everything before. This could be a huge improvement for your team. These aren't bad if you're on the longer time frame, but I think we all should be looking for, is there anything we can do, anything that would provide better value for our customer, any way we can change the way we're working that would drive us to a shorter time scale? And one thing in talking about this, things that aren't actually done, the Agile Lunch and Learn site that I use, that it sends out the invitations, is where I list all the upcoming events. It's at events.xeric.net. That site, when we were developing that and trying to get the simplest thing out there that was possible, so we had everything together, we kind of had it working, and it felt like we were done, right? We had proved we were able to send these emails through this little SMTP server we had set up in our in our testing stuff. It seemed to work. Like, okay, so we're done. Not so fast, right? We had to set up our DNS and where we were deploying it. We had to set up SSL on that. We had to set up SMTP for sending email and go through all the hoops that you have to do to make sure that will actually end up in somebody's mailbox. We had to figure out how to clear the cache, something that we didn't experience in our local environment. And then there were deployment issues. And my point here is this was just a list of some of the things that had to happen in order to get from when we were done with the software to where it was actually delivering us value. And the reason we want to push so hard to get all the way through production is because all this stuff represents hidden work unless we actually encounter it. And it's really hard to predict what those things are until you've run into them and actually tried to deploy it through to production. So delivering to production is another big thing to coach teams on, is the focus on delivering to production, and that's what we want to say is actually how we complete our work. Is it more valuable to take what we have to the next environment or create new features? This is something you see a lot. It's like, okay, well, we got this to this environment, so we know we can deploy it to production. You may think you can, but you don't know until you've actually done it. Would it be more valuable to get that into your customers' hands, or would it be more valuable to go back and start keep working on new features? In a lot of cases, getting it in the customer's hands will get you a return on investment and feedback that will make the rest of your work way more efficient. Do we have proof that the current features can be deployed to production? Are we just hoping? When it comes to deploying their code to production, developers can be some of the most hopeful people, most optimistic people out there, right? Yeah, I worked here locally. I deployed it to our environment in the cloud. It should work just fine to production. That's often not the case, right? The way we make it more likely to be the case is small deploys very, very repeatedly. So if there is a problem, you discover it sooner. And what's our cycle time to get to production? This should be something that we're trying to constantly drive down. The more we drive that down, it means the less friction there is in our development process of getting things into the hand of the customer, and the more willing we will be to take on smaller chunks and get them delivered all the way through. The more willing we are to take on smaller chunks, the faster feedback we can get back from the customers, which allows our chunks that we are delivering to be a lot more focused on what they actually need. Okay, next point with thinking about coaching Agile teams is deliver things that delight the customer. So here's a picture to help you remember that. So this girl has been delivered something and she's hoping it will delight her and be a pony. I'll give you a hint, it probably is not a pony. But we want our customers to be as delighted with what we give them as this young girl would be if she opened that box and it somehow magically sprung out a pony. So delivering things that delight the customer. So things to ask your team is, does our customer have any idea of what we're demonstrating to them? If we're demonstrating things to them that they don't really understand what it is, we're not working in slices that make sense for the customer. I've been on demos where, in order to make sure that everybody felt like they were being valued for what they were working on, the demos for the customer of the software that was being delivered that sprint was a developer opening up a terminal and typing in some commands and showing that they had figured out how to use some piece of software. That's not something that delights the customer, and it's not something that actually shows the customer, here's what we're giving you. Those types of approaches to doing demo, okay, so that's a whole nother topic, but we need to be thinking about how do we work in sections that let us actually deliver things to the customer in ways that delight them. If we're breaking up in our work in ways that we're feeling we're needing to show them that things that the customer really isn't going to understand or be excited about, we probably should rethink how we're doing our work. And think about, can we do our work in slices that have clear return on investment to your customer? Now, that doesn't mean you have to do huge things. Even something as simple as saying, hey, this is the very first sprint. We were able to get your logo into the application. It now shows up on this HTML site that we've deployed to our production environment. That's, it's maybe not live yet, but your logo is on the page, and we have a process for doing that. That's something, customer sees their logo on the page, that means something to them, right? It's like, this is starting to take shape, and it's about me, not about the technology. What will the customer be able to do after the sprint that they couldn't do before? And going to a web page that's going to house the application and seeing that their logo's on the page when it wasn't there before is a step in the right direction. It's very, very small, but that's still very much an improvement of saying, oh yeah, we worked on some technical things, figured out how to use the program over here. Maybe we'll have something more interesting to show you next sprint. Another point, measure progress correctly. So here's some people measuring progress or measuring weights in ways that aren't correct from the Saturday Evening Post. And I like that because it reminds me that sometimes you've got different ways of people with different goals, especially over here, different goals are trying to measure progress in different ways. We often think that we're going to have something like this, right? We're going to work and gradually, more and more stuff will be done until we get to 100%. If we are measuring progress correctly, we should be able to do something like this. If we are not measuring progress correctly, we will likely have something where we say we're making lots and lots of progress and then it slows down. If we're not deploying our code all the way through the environments to production and making code that's ready, that is deployable to production, that's got everything it needs, we're going to go real fast because we're not doing everything. And then when we hit the hidden work, it's going to slow down. So we want to measure progress in a way that makes sure that we're not deceiving ourselves like that red line. Even if it's a little bit slower at the beginning with the white line as we figure things out, that's probably better because it better represents what we're delivering. So what are the chances that the last 10 stories you finished will have a week or more of hidden work? So stories that, if you've got a definition of finished that isn't all the way to production, so it's code complete, but it hasn't been deployed to production, what are the chances that there's going to be hidden work once the user is able to use it in production? Now, I'm impressed. We've got teams here that have never had any hidden work, so that's pretty impressive. And it may be what you're saying is that you don't say it's done until you've gotten past the point that there could be any hidden work, and that's great. So, like I said, it's not like, oh, it's wrong if you're here or wrong if you're here. But if you are at 90% or greater, and there's usually hidden work, you might think about, are we are we thinking that we start here and finish here? But really, we need to think about the fact that we're finishing here, because that's what represents the way that we need to be measuring progress, because that's a better representation of it, because there's this work there and we know that we're going to hit it, on a regular basis we hit it. We should probably just include that within the definition of what we say, okay, now this part is finished. So measure progress correctly. So some questions to ask your team, ask yourself: are we measuring technical steps as progress or working software that provides business capabilities? How much hidden work remains? And if it's hidden, we may not know, right? But based on our past experiences, are we putting a boundary somewhere that it really should be a little bit further in order to make sure there's not hidden work that we don't know about? And are we measuring code that we might be able to deliver to the customer as progress instead of code that we have actually delivered? Embrace iterative improvements. So iterative improvements, you've probably seen this diagram. It gets maligned a lot and I think misunderstood. But the main idea here is, if we've got a customer that wants to get between 2 points, if we give them a skateboard and they're able to get down their street to their school, that might be a great thing to start getting feedback on. And they may discover the skateboard, like, hey, the skateboard works good. I thought I needed the car, but this actually works really well for me, but it's not as stable as I want. And maybe you get to the point where you turn it into a scooter and they're like, yeah, this actually does what I need. This solves my pressing problem. There's this other problem I wanted to deal with now. Whereas if you just started out building a car, you would end up delivering them a car without going through that iteration of giving them something, getting feedback, and giving them something else. If we get to the point that you've delivered them a bicycle and you find out and they're like, hey, this is great, but there's some places I can't go with it. And you say, okay, well, where are you trying to go? I'm like, well, I really want to visit Italy. And you're in the United States. Getting them a motorcycle or a car is not going to fix the problem of them getting to Italy. Maybe they need a boat, or you need to tell them about plane tickets or something like that. It may be perfectly adequate for the things you've built up to that point. So this idea of iteratively giving them something that lets them take a small step in what their capabilities and then delivering something else is a huge part. And I mentioned it before, but on like the Agile Lunch and Learn site, the original version of that was just done in Excel, how we managed things. And then I stuck it in a database and had some scripts that I ran. And we just kept iterating. And a lot of the things that I was envisioning originally when I was thinking about how the site would work turned out to be really bad ideas as I took incremental steps. And it evolved based on doing small things and moving forward with that. So embracing iterative improvements. Questions to ask yourself, ask your team is there any piece of this story, is any piece of this story more valuable than the others? And could we deliver that piece first? Are we prioritizing the magnitude of what is delivered over the frequency at which we deliver? So are we feeling better about ourselves because we delivered 5 stories, even though it took us two months to deliver it, or whatever the time period is? Or are we more excited about the fact that we got this story done in 2 days and all the way through, and then we started on the next story? We need to be thinking about the frequency that we deliver things, because that's what drives our feedback. Could we get feedback on half of this ticket while we work on the second half? So is there a piece of this that we could actually deliver that the customer could start to use, and then we can work on the second half? And it has happened many times. I've seen when we've tried to do something like this and the developers and the customer start working together to have a conversation about this, that they're able to split the story in a way to give them what the customer needs, what the user needs right then, and the other part then is no longer very important and maybe doesn't get done at all. I've mentioned the idea of this site that would pop up, an intranet site that would pop up with a bar at the top saying if they had important announcements. And this was back during like COVID announcements about, when returning to work, stuff like that, vaccine status, or whether you need vaccine masks and things like that. And they had a very robust way that they wanted to schedule those things. But the developers were able to say, hey, we'll give you a box, you type stuff in it, and it'll pop up, you take stuff out of it, and it disappears. It was a very small portion of what was being asked for. But once that was delivered, and it just only took them a few days, the customer was like, hey, you know what? That actually gives me 95% of the value I need. I do want this other stuff later, but let's see if we can do the same thing with this other story and get a piece of it really, really quick, because this is really valuable to me, and I want to get that rapid, that return on investment. Let's see if we can do that with something else. Okay, defer everything possible. So if you defer everything possible, you are only left with, let's see, what was this one? Active, okay. So question about deferring everything possible. If you defer everything possible, you're only left with what? The minimally viable solution, things no one wants, things that are less exciting. So if we defer everything possible and we end up with things that no one wants, then we've probably deferred, then it probably means the project shouldn't have been done at all. But what usually should happen is if you defer everything that is possible, you should be left. Our stakeholders tell us that nothing is possible to defer. And I've had those conversations before. Usually the reason that people are saying that nothing is possible to defer is because they've been in situations where if they don't get it now, they're never going to get it. And so usually what you want to do, using the word defer in those situations probably isn't the best way to do it, because to them, defer means they're never going to get it. What I like to do is ask and say, is there any, you've got these, we've got 100 things you're asking for. Some of these things, there may be some possible future that you would be willing to go live, not finished development, but you would be willing to go live without some of these features. There are some of these features that there is no possible future that you could go live without it. Let's make sure that we sequence stuff in such a way that we do those things that there's no possible way to go live without, because that gives you some options in the future to go live sooner. And if you find for some reason you need to, yes, they won't get the rest based on history. And that's a tough thing. The best way I know is to start showing them, if you can start showing them a consistent pattern of delivering things quickly all the way through and showing it to them, it gives them the ability to feel more comfortable in actually prioritizing something. Here's a graphic I use with some teams of saying, okay, we've got capable of demonstrations. Feature, create a rough means of producing the desired result. Orange, it's deployable to production. Green, it's viable as the system of record. We've got enough things together that we could use this as the system of record, even though it may not be as good. It's definitely not as good as we want. It may not even be as good as what we're replacing, but it's enough that we could actually operate the system. Other existing features, current state features that aren't absolutely required to go live, and then new features. What happens lots of times is you start on a new project and everybody wants to start on those purple features over there to show people they can do it, because that's how we're justifying working on the project, is doing these really, really cool things. If we sequence things like that, we're going to go over here, and this is the only option to go live. The only way we can go live is get everything done. On the other hand, if we're very disciplined in how we sequence stuff, we could get to the point where we can go live. We could potentially go live right after we finish the green ones down here at the bottom. That's much, much sooner. Now, we don't have to go live then. We are fine with doing everything all the way to the end. But the point is, this gives us some options that let us lower risk in ways that we don't have if we deal with it, if we do this up here. And this is a very, very big deal to people. Matter of fact, if this slide seems helpful, send me an email. I can send you a copy of it, because this has resonated well with a lot of stakeholders of understanding why we want them to actually sequence stuff. Here's a conversation, a made-up SMS chat that's very similar to a real conversation I had. So this person was saying, if we don't build this complex feature today, because they were trying to do something, and I was, as a coach, was saying, I think there's a possible future where you would be willing to go live without that. We need to do that. It needs to be lower on the priority list. This person said, if we don't build this complex feature today, we will never come back and build it. And I said, okay, so this feature will never be the next most important thing for the customer. The person said, exactly. I said, and you still want to build it now instead of the things that are the next most important thing for the customer? And the answer was yes. And I was confused. But in this particular process, that drove a lot of things. As a matter of fact, it drove a lot of things, so the cost of development was so high that the people paying for it eventually shut the project down. So, but this is what happens when we get it's easy to get so focused on this thing being important, and it's what we want, and it may be the entire reason why I want to do this project. But if we do it in the wrong sequence, we can end up with just running out of money. Whereas if you do it where we're delivering value, it's a lot easier for the customer to keep paying for something when it's giving them something as you go. Okay, defer everything possible. Everything we choose means not doing something else. What are we choosing not to do? And this is one way of thinking of deferring stuff. Like, if we're going to do this, what are the things that we're saying we're not going to do? What are the things we're saying are less important, that we're prioritizing more than this? And if we have this idea that we're just going to go all the way through the end and then deploy put it in production, it's harder for people to think in terms of what's actually most important to work on next. Will our future selves be happy with our sequencing? That's a question, good thing to ask. Is there any possible future where we could go live without this story? Make sure you understand your trade-offs. And with the idea of trade-offs, deferring tests is usually much more expensive than deferring some technical debt. If I have tests, it's a lot easier for me to come back and deal with some technical debt later if I've got really, really robust tests. However, if I get rid of my technical debt, or if I decide I'm not going to have any technical debt and I'm really, really focusing on making sure there's nothing I would ever want to change technically, but I don't do my tests, that's probably going to slow me down a lot more, or probably going to impede my ability to deliver. These trade-offs, there's lots of things we could talk about that. But the thing I want to do in thinking of deferring what's possible, we still want to have a definition of done that we're happy with. We're not wanting to defer things on the definition of done. The definition of done should be something that will allow us to have this continual iterative, continually deploying without like, oh, I made it look like I've got a bunch of progress, but I didn't. So when we're talking about deferring things, we're talking about deferring features that the software does, not deferring things on our definition of done. So in summary, start on the right, emphasize the definition of done, deliver to production, deliver things that delight the customer, measure project progress correctly, embrace iterative improvements, and defer everything possible to get to a point that you could go live and continue iterating on that. Okay, we're a little bit short on time, but we'll go through it quick. So join the quiz. If you would like to join the quiz, we're going to give away a t-shirt that reminds us of the principle of face-to-face communication. If you're on a lot of video calls and everybody's got their video off, this is a good way to make sure that people are remembering, hey, I can turn my video on to better communicate face-to-face. So I think I've got every size yet to go. And okay, let me post this link right here in case anyone needs that instead. I will give it 3 more seconds. Got 29 people. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Okay, which is not a benefit of starting on the right? It helps focus on finishing work that's in progress. Which is not, remember, it helps you start earning a return on investment sooner. It helps you learn things you may need to know for subsequent stories, or it measures with the correct units, which is not a benefit of starting on the right. And yes, it measures with correct units is not a benefit of starting on the right. All these others are things that are actually a benefit of starting on the right. Sorry, a little bit tricky question when we do it as a negative. What should you defer? Should you defer the hard stuff? Things you could possibly go live without? Things that require database changes or automated tests? What things should you defer? Doesn't mean you're not ever going to do them, but you're just saying, I'm going to choose to do other things first. And yes, things that you could possibly go live without are the things you want to defer. If any of those other things fall into the category of things you could possibly go live without, but you want to make sure you get to the point that you could go live because that reduces your risk. Leaderboard. Okay, we got Mike in the top place, followed by Rob, Dave, Shushma, and Ian. Very good. Which is usually worse to defer? Automated tests or technical debt? Which is worse to defer? If I defer one of these, it's worse than deferring the other. And yes, it is usually worse to defer automated tests. And the reason I say that is if I have some technical debt, something that I want to change, I'm like, this works, this lets us deliver to the customer, but I probably want to come back and change this later. If I have automated tests, that change becomes easy to make in the future. If I do not have automated tests, I'm now in a position where it's very scary to make that change. So usually it is worse to, and it obviously depends on the magnitude, but from what we were talking about, we usually want to make sure that we're getting the automated tests as part of what we're doing. If we have to do something like, I'm using this version of something, there's a new version coming out that I want to upgrade to at some point, but I can't deliver as quickly for the customer if I use that new version. That may be technical debt, but that's not nearly as bad as not having automated tests. Okay, Rob's in top spot, followed by Dave, Shushma, Tom, and Michael. How should we measure progress? Should it be the lines of code, working code that's in the customer's hands that's providing return on investment, what stage the project is complete, requirements code testing, developers' estimates of the percentage of each story complete. How should we measure progress? And yes, working code that is in the customer's hands that's providing return on investment. The stage of the project that's complete, if we try to do our stuff with requirements and say, okay, we're 30% done because we've done all of our requirements, and now we're going to be 30% done because we're done with coding and breaking it up like that, there could be a lot of hidden work in that. That's probably what we want to avoid. That gets into waterfall. That's usually the way waterfall projects are delivered, which doesn't take advantage of the iterative aspect of Agile. Developers' estimate of each percentage, developers' estimate of the percentage of each story complete means that we've got stories that aren't actually done yet. If we hold off on saying that we're going to measure progress until something's actually done, we get a much better view of reality. Okay, sorry, we're a little bit over. Rob, Dave, Tizzy, Michael, Shushma, and 20 partially completed houses represent significant what without any what? Significant planning without any gumption, significant code violations without any management, significant trees without any recycled plastic, or significant investment without any return. Yes, 20 partially completed houses represent significant investment without any return. We've got all these houses that no one can live in yet, so no one's going to give us any money for. And remember, our point was that when it comes to software, we'd rather get those into the hands of the customer and earning return on investment. In a lot of cases in houses as well. But something that's in progress isn't actually earning your return on investment yet. And okay, congratulations, Rob. Okay, Rob, so send me an email, t-shirt size and address, and we will get a copy of your t-shirt. Congratulations, everyone else. Thank you so much for coming. It'll be a few weeks before we have another Lunch and Learn, but we'll be watching for those invites. Also be aware I may do one at a different time to try to get for people in different time zones, so check the time on some of them as they come up. Probably around October, we'll get back into the regular cadence again. But thank you, and I'm going to stick around. If anyone wants to chat about anything, feel free to either type it in the chat or come off mute. I'd love to talk to you. Thank you so much.